the shocking truth behind Christianity's creation and the Roman conspiracy to invent Jesus. What if everything you've been told about Christianity's origins is a carefully orchestrated lie? What if the most influential religion in human history wasn't born from divine revelation, but from the calculated minds of Roman emperors seeking to control their rebellious subjects? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most controversial theories in religious scholarship, one that challenges the very foundation of Western civilization and suggests that Jesus Christ himself may have been the ultimate propaganda tool. You're about to discover evidence that points to a shocking possibility: that Christianity wasn't the organic growth of a Jewish messianic movement, but rather the deliberate creation of a powerful Roman dynasty. A dynasty that needed to solve a very specific problem. How do you control millions of people who refuse to worship your emperor as a god? How do you pacify a population that would rather die than submit to foreign rule? The answer, according to some scholars, was brilliant in its simplicity. You give them a different Messiah to worship, one who preaches submission instead of rebellion. But before we dive into this rabbit hole, let me be clear about something. This isn't an attack on faith itself. Millions of people have found genuine meaning, comfort, and moral guidance through Christianity. The question we're exploring isn't whether these teachings have value, but whether their historical origins are what we've been told. Because if the foundation story is fabricated, what does that mean for everything built upon it? The story begins in the 1st century, in a region that would become the powder keg of the ancient world, Palestine, a land occupied by Roman legions, ruled by puppet kings, and seething with religious fervor. The Jews of this era weren't passive subjects. They were a proud people with ancient traditions, divine promises, and an unshakable belief that their God would send them a deliverer, a Messiah who would drive out the foreign oppressors and restore their nation to glory. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it was active rebellion. The Jewish scriptures were filled with prophecies about a coming warrior king who would possess the power of God himself. Someone who could defeat any army, topple any empire, and establish divine rule on earth. These weren't metaphorical promises to these people. They were literal expectations that fueled a revolutionary movement spanning decades. And here's what makes this story so fascinating. The Hebrew word for this promised deliverer was Mashiach, which translates into Greek as Christos. That's right. Christ wasn't originally a name. It was a title, a designation that could apply to any number of messianic leaders who emerged during this turbulent period. Leaders who gathered followers, proclaimed divine authority, and led armed resistance against Roman rule. The Romans had dealt with rebellious provinces before, but Judea presented unique challenges. Unlike other conquered territories where local gods could be incorporated into the Roman pantheon, Jewish monotheism was uncompromising. The Jews absolutely refused to acknowledge Caesar as divine. They wouldn't bow to imperial statues. They wouldn't participate in emperor worship. And their religious texts actively encouraged them to resist foreign domination. This created a crisis that went far beyond military control. The Roman Empire wasn't just a political entity. It was a carefully constructed system of cultural assimilation, where conquered peoples gradually adopted Roman customs, language, and religious practices. But the Jews weren't assimilating. Instead, they were becoming more radicalized, more unified in their opposition, and more dangerous to imperial stability. The situation exploded in 66 CE, when the Jews launched a full-scale rebellion that shocked the Roman world. This wasn't a minor uprising or a local disturbance. The Jewish rebels actually defeated Roman forces in several major battles and established an independent state right in the heart of the empire. They minted their own coins, set up their own government, and proved that Rome wasn't invincible. The Emperor Nero responded by deploying his finest military commanders to crush this rebellion. Two men who would later reshape not just the political landscape of Rome, but potentially the spiritual landscape of the entire Western world. Vespasian and his son, Titus Flavius. These weren't ordinary generals. They were members of an ambitious family that had spent years honing their skills in psychological warfare. The Flavians had previously waged a campaign against the Druids in Britain and Gaul that went beyond mere military conquest. They had systematically destroyed not just the Druid armies, but their entire cultural and religious infrastructure. Temples were demolished, sacred texts were burned, and the oral traditions that had sustained Celtic spirituality for centuries were deliberately eradicated. The Druids didn't just lose a war, they were erased from history so completely that almost no authentic records of their beliefs survived. This experience had taught the Flavians something crucial about controlling populations. Physical force alone wasn't enough. You had to win the war of ideas. You had to control the narrative. You had to reshape how people thought about their relationship with divine authority and political power. When they arrived in Judea, the Flavians brought this same psychological approach to their military campaign. But they also encountered something unexpected. A Jewish rebel leader named Josephus bar Matthias, who would become instrumental in what some scholars believe was the most audacious propaganda operation in human history. Josephus had been captured during the siege of a Galilean town, and facing certain death, he made a desperate gamble. He claimed to be a prophet and declared that the Jewish scriptures actually foretold that Vespasian would become emperor of Rome. This wasn't just flattery. It was a sophisticated reinterpretation of messianic prophecy that suggested the Jewish God had chosen a Roman leader as his anointed one. Whether Vespasian believed this prophecy or simply found it useful, he spared Josephus's life and brought him into his inner circle. The former Jewish rebel became a Roman collaborator, using his intimate knowledge of Jewish scripture and custom to help the Flavians understand their enemy's deepest beliefs and motivations. Meanwhile, the political situation in Rome was becoming increasingly unstable. Nero's excesses had finally caught up with him, and in 68 CE, he committed suicide rather than face deposition by the Senate. This created a power vacuum that multiple generals tried to fill, leading to a brutal civil war known as the Year of Four Emperors. Vespasian, still in the middle of his campaign against the Jewish rebels, saw an opportunity. He left his son Titus to continue the siege of Jerusalem while he returned to Rome to seize the imperial throne. The Flavians, a family with no aristocratic pedigree or divine lineage, had become the rulers of the Roman Empire through military force alone. This presented them with a unique challenge. Previous emperor dynasties had claimed legitimacy through blood ties to deified rulers or connections to ancient Roman nobility. The Flavians had none of these advantages. They were military upstarts who had taken power through a coup, and they needed to establish their authority through other means. Back in Judea, Titus was systematically destroying the Jewish rebellion. He encircled Jerusalem with a siege wall, starved the population into submission, and in 70 CE razed the sacred temple to the ground. The destruction was so complete that, according to historical accounts, not one stone was left standing upon another. But the Flavians didn't just want to win a military victory. They wanted to ensure that Jewish messianic movements could never again threaten Roman stability, and they had learned something crucial from their captured documents and interrogated prisoners. The Jews' resistance wasn't just political, it was theological. Their willingness to die rather than submit came from their unshakable belief that God would intervene on their behalf through a divine Messiah. So the Flavians faced a strategic question that would have profound implications for the next 2,000 years. How do you neutralize a religious movement without creating martyrs? How do you redirect messianic expectations away from rebellion and towards submission? How do you transform a warrior Messiah into a pacifist savior? According to some scholars, the answer was to give the Jews exactly what they were looking for, but in a form that served Roman interests instead of threatening them. They would create a new Messiah, one who fulfilled Jewish prophecy but preached Roman values, one who commanded spiritual authority but discouraged political resistance, one who promised divine reward for earthly submission. This wasn't just theological manipulation. It was literary warfare conducted by some of the most sophisticated minds of the ancient world. The Flavians had access to the captured Jewish scriptures, collaborative relationships with Jewish intellectuals like Josephus, and the resources of the Roman imperial bureaucracy. They possessed both the motivation and the means to undertake one of the most ambitious propaganda projects in human history. The evidence for this theory, according to its proponents, lies hidden in plain sight within the texts that form the foundation of Christianity. But to understand this evidence, we need to examine not just what these texts say, but how they were constructed, when they were written, and most importantly, who had the power and motivation to create them. Because if this theory is correct, then the story of Jesus Christ isn't the biography of a historical figure. It's the literary creation of a Roman imperial dynasty that needed to solve a political problem through religious innovation. And the implications of that possibility extend far beyond ancient history into the very heart of how power, faith, and truth intersect in our modern world. The rabbit hole goes deeper than most people imagine, and what we find at the bottom might change everything we thought we knew about one of humanity's most influential belief systems. The question isn't just whether Jesus existed as a historical person. The question is whether Christianity itself was designed from the ground up as a tool of imperial control, wrapped in the language of spiritual liberation, but serving the interests of earthly power. The construction of this new religious narrative required more than just political motivation. It demanded literary genius, intimate knowledge of Jewish scripture, and access to resources that only the most powerful families in the Roman Empire possessed. The Flavians didn't just stumble into this project. They assembled what amounted to an ancient think tank, bringing together some of the most brilliant minds of their era to solve an unprecedented challenge. At the center of this operation was their newly adopted family member, Josephus. This former Jewish rebel had transformed himself into Flavius Josephus, taking the family name of his captors and becoming their chief historian and cultural interpreter. But Josephus wasn't working alone. The Flavians had cultivated relationships with other influential Jewish intellectuals, particularly members of the wealthy Alexandrian family who served as Rome's tax collectors in Egypt. The Alexanders weren't just collaborators. They were pioneers in a new form of religious thinking that would prove crucial to the Christian project. Philo of Alexandria, one of their most prominent members, had already begun the work of merging Jewish monotheism with Greek philosophy and Roman imperial concepts. His writings described a divine logos, an intermediary between God and humanity that bore striking resemblances to concepts that would later appear in Christian theology. These weren't coincidences. They were building blocks in a carefully orchestrated campaign to create a new form of Judaism that would serve imperial interests rather than threaten them. The Alexanders had every reason to support this project. As Rome's tax collectors, their wealth and position depended entirely on maintaining Roman control over Jewish territories. Any successful messianic movement would mean the end of their privileged status. Another crucial collaborator came from the Herod family, the puppet rulers who had governed Judea on Rome's behalf. Princess Berenice, granddaughter of Herod the Great, had become Titus's mistress during the siege of Jerusalem. This wasn't just a romantic relationship. It was a political alliance that gave the Flavians access to intimate knowledge of Jewish royal traditions and religious expectations. Berenice understood something that purely Roman minds might have missed. The Jews weren't just waiting for any Messiah. They were expecting a specific type of deliverer who would fulfill particular prophecies in recognizable ways. Any successful counterfeit would need to check these boxes while subtly redirecting the narrative toward Roman goals. The financial resources for this project came from the wealthiest sources available. The Flavians themselves were now emperors with access to the Roman treasury. The Alexanders controlled vast commercial networks across the Mediterranean, and the spoils from the destruction of Jerusalem, including the sacred vessels from the temple itself, provided both symbolic authority and material wealth to fund the operation. But perhaps the most crucial resource was time. Unlike military campaigns that demanded immediate results, this psychological operation could unfold gradually. The Gospels weren't rushed into circulation. They were crafted with the patience of master storytellers who understood that believable fiction requires careful attention to detail, character development, and narrative consistency. The literary technique they employed was sophisticated beyond anything most modern readers recognize. Ancient Jewish scripture used a complex system called typology, where events from one era were deliberately paralleled in later stories to show divine patterns recurring throughout history. The Flavian writers didn't just copy this technique, they weaponized it. They created a figure whose life story would mirror key events from Jewish history, while simultaneously echoing the military campaign that Titus had just completed in Judea. This wasn't accidental parallelism, it was deliberate coding that served multiple purposes. Surface readers would see fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. Deeper readers who understood the typological system would recognize the true author's identity. The genius of this approach becomes clear when you examine the specific parallels. Jesus begins his ministry at the Sea of Galilee, the same location where Titus launched his campaign. Both gather followers who are told not to fear and to follow their leader. Jesus promises to make his disciples fishers of men. Titus literally makes his soldiers fishers of men by using spears to catch Jewish rebels attempting to swim to safety after their boats are destroyed. These aren't vague similarities that could apply to any two stories. They're precise correspondences in names, locations, and sequence of events that demonstrate intentional construction. The Gospel writers weren't recording random memories of a historical figure. They were following a blueprint that connected their narrative to recent Roman military victories. The psychological impact of this technique would have been devastating to Jewish resistance movements. Imagine discovering that your most sacred prophecies about a coming Messiah had already been fulfilled, not by a Jewish deliverer, but by the Roman general who destroyed your temple. The very texts that had inspired rebellion were now proving that God had chosen Rome's representatives as his anointed ones. But the Flavians weren't content with just neutralizing Jewish messianic expectations. They wanted to create a replacement theology that would actively support imperial authority. The Jesus they constructed doesn't just avoid political resistance, he explicitly endorses it. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's becomes a divine commandment. Turning the other cheek transforms from passive resistance into active collaboration with oppression. The transformation of Jewish warrior Messiah expectations into Christian pacifist theology wasn't subtle. It was a complete inversion of everything the original messianic movement represented. Where Jewish rebels had expected their deliverer to overthrow foreign rule, the Christian Messiah teaches submission to it. Where Jewish prophecy promised the destruction of Rome's enemies, Christian teaching demands love for those enemies. This theological reversal had practical implications that extended far beyond Palestine. Throughout the Roman Empire, Jewish communities had been supporting the rebellion with money, weapons, and volunteers. Christian communities, by contrast, would become model citizens who paid their taxes, obeyed imperial laws, and taught their children to respect Roman authority as divinely ordained. The dissemination of this new religion followed the same networks that had previously spread Jewish resistance literature. But instead of carrying messages of rebellion, these networks now carried gospels that promoted submission. The Roman road system, originally built for military purposes, became the distribution network for a new form of ideological control that was far more effective than armies. The early Christian communities weren't grassroots movements of oppressed people seeking liberation. They were carefully managed experiments in social control, funded by imperial resources and guided by Roman political objectives. The bishops and priests who led these communities weren't humble servants emerging from the masses. They were members of the same aristocratic families that had previously served as priests in pagan Roman temples. The transition from paganism to Christianity wasn't the spiritual revolution that traditional history describes. It was a rebranding campaign that preserved existing power structures while giving them new theological justification. The Pope inherited the title Pontifex Maximus that had previously belonged to pagan high priests. Christian churches were built on the foundations of pagan temples. The rituals, hierarchies, and symbols of the old religion were transferred wholesale to the new one. Even the timing of Christian holy days reveals this continuity. December 25th had been the birthday of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god worshipped throughout the Roman Empire. Easter coincided with spring fertility celebrations that had been observed for millennia. These weren't accidents or organic developments. They were deliberate decisions made by people who understood that successful propaganda must incorporate familiar elements while redirecting their meaning. The psychological sophistication of this operation becomes even more apparent when you examine how it handled the problem of Jewish scripture. The Flavians couldn't simply ignore or suppress the texts that had inspired the rebellion. Too many people knew them too well. Instead, they reinterpreted them. Every prophecy about a coming Messiah was redirected away from future expectations and toward their own constructed narrative. Jesus becomes the fulfillment of Isaiah's suffering servant prophecies. His death and resurrection satisfy the requirements for sacrificial atonement that had previously required temple rituals. His teachings replace the complex legal system of Torah observance with simpler commands that happen to align perfectly with Roman imperial values. This wasn't theological evolution. It was theological engineering, conducted by people who understood exactly what they were trying to achieve. The result was a religion that looked Jewish enough to attract Jewish converts, while serving Roman interests so completely that it would eventually become the official religion of the empire itself. The evidence for this conspiracy isn't hidden in secret documents or archaeological discoveries that mainstream scholars ignore. It's embedded in the very texts that Christians read every Sunday, written in a literary code that the Flavians expected future readers to eventually decipher. They left their signature in the parallels between gospel stories and Roman military campaigns, confident that someday someone would possess both the knowledge and the courage to reveal what they had done. That revelation wouldn't just expose an ancient conspiracy, it would illuminate how power operates in every era, using the highest human aspirations as tools for the most earthly purposes. The story of Christianity's origins isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting the eternal dance between authority and resistance, between those who rule and those who believe. The mechanics of how this literary deception was executed reveal layers of sophistication that most people never consider. When we examine the Gospels not as sacred texts but as constructed narratives, patterns emerge that point directly to their true authors. These weren't simple fishermen recording memories of their beloved teacher. These were skilled propagandists working from a carefully planned blueprint. Consider the language itself. The Gospels were written in Greek, not Aramaic or Hebrew. This wasn't because the authors were trying to reach a wider audience. It was because Greek was the language of Roman administration and intellectual discourse. The quality of the Greek used in these texts demonstrates education levels that would have been impossible for the humble Galilean peasants they claim to represent. But the linguistic evidence goes deeper than mere fluency. The Gospels employ sophisticated rhetorical techniques that were taught in Roman schools of rhetoric. They use literary devices that appear throughout classical Roman literature. They reference concepts from Greek philosophy that had been integrated into Roman imperial ideology. These aren't accidental borrowings. They're the fingerprints of authors trained in Roman educational systems. The theological architecture of Christianity reveals even more telling evidence of its true origins. The concept of a dying and resurrecting God-man wasn't unique to Christianity. It was a common theme throughout Mediterranean mystery religions that had existed for centuries before Jesus supposedly lived. Mithras, Dionysus, Attis, and dozens of other deities had followed similar patterns of death and rebirth that promised spiritual transformation to their followers. The Flavians didn't invent these concepts. They synthesized them. They took the most appealing elements from existing mystery religions and combined them with Jewish messianic expectations to create something that would satisfy both audiences. The result was a hybrid theology that felt familiar to pagans while appearing to fulfill Jewish prophecy. This synthesis explains why Christianity spread so rapidly through the Roman Empire, despite supposedly being a persecuted religion. The truth is that Christianity wasn't persecuted by Rome. It was promoted by Rome. The persecutions that traditional history describes were directed against genuine Jewish messianic movements and Gnostic Christians who threatened imperial authority. The pacifist Christians who preached submission to Caesar were left alone to grow and prosper. The supposed martyrdoms that form such a central part of Christian mythology begin to look very different when examined through this lens. Many of these stories were created long after the alleged events, often centuries later, by church historians who needed to establish their religion's credentials as a persecuted faith. The martyrdom narratives served the same purpose as the gospel stories themselves. They created emotional investment in beliefs that served imperial interests. The transformation of Christianity from a supposed Jewish sect into the official religion of Rome wasn't a miraculous conversion of imperial power. It was the completion of a long-term strategic plan. Constantine didn't embrace Christianity despite its challenge to imperial authority. He embraced it because it had always been designed to support that authority. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE wasn't a gathering of humble bishops seeking theological truth. It was a political convention where imperial representatives finalized the details of a religious system that had been in development for over 2 centuries. The debates about Christ's divine nature weren't spiritual discussions. They were negotiations about how to present imperial propaganda in the most compelling theological package. The books that were included in the biblical canon and those that were excluded reveal the same political calculations. The Gnostic Gospels that portrayed Jesus as a spiritual teacher, encouraging individual enlightenment, were banned as heretical. The texts that emphasized church hierarchy, priestly authority, and submission to earthly powers were preserved as orthodox truth. This wasn't divine inspiration guiding these decisions. It was imperial policy determining which version of Christianity would serve Roman interests most effectively. The geographical spread of Christianity follows patterns that confirm its artificial origins. Instead of growing organically from Palestine outward, Christianity appeared almost simultaneously in major Roman cities throughout the empire. This wasn't because traveling missionaries were unusually effective at converting pagans. It was because the same administrative networks that managed Roman governance were being used to establish Christian communities. The early Christian bishops weren't chosen by their congregations based on spiritual qualities. They were appointed by Roman officials based on their loyalty to imperial policy. Many of them were members of the same aristocratic families that had previously served as priests in pagan temples. The transition from paganism to Christianity at the leadership level was seamless because it was planned that way. The financial resources that supported early Christian expansion came from the same sources that funded other imperial projects. The magnificent churches that appeared throughout the empire weren't built through small donations from poor believers. They were constructed using imperial wealth and slave labor, just like Roman temples, bathhouses, and amphitheaters. The artistic and architectural styles used in these early churches reveal the same imperial influence. Instead of developing uniquely Christian aesthetics, these buildings incorporated design elements from Roman civic architecture. The symbolism used in early Christian art drew heavily from imperial iconography. Even the fish symbol that became so central to Christian identity had been used previously to represent imperial authority in Roman contexts. The speed with which Christian theology developed into complex doctrinal systems also suggests artificial construction rather than organic growth. Religions that develop naturally typically require centuries to establish sophisticated theological frameworks. Christianity appeared with fully formed doctrines about Trinity, salvation, and church authority that matched the complexity of systems that had taken other religions millennia to develop. The legal frameworks that governed early Christian communities were adapted directly from Roman civil law rather than Jewish religious law. The hierarchical structure of the church mirrored Roman administrative organization. The procedures for selecting leaders, resolving disputes, and managing resources all followed Roman institutional models rather than Jewish or other religious precedents. Even the calendar that Christians used reveals Roman rather than Jewish influences. Instead of following Jewish festival cycles that were tied to agricultural seasons and historical events specific to Jewish experience, Christian holy days were aligned with Roman civic celebrations and pagan religious observances that the empire. The educational had already been established throughout systems that preserved and transmitted Christian teachings were modeled on Roman schools rather than Jewish study traditions. The methods used to train priests and bishops followed Roman pedagogical approaches. The languages, texts, and intellectual frameworks that shaped Christian scholarship were derived from Roman academic institutions rather than Jewish religious schools. The economic structures that supported Christian communities integrated seamlessly with Roman commercial networks. Instead of developing alternative economic systems based on Jewish principles of Jubilee, Sabbath years, or communal property ownership, Christian communities adopted Roman practices of private property, wage labor, and commercial exchange that supported imperial economic interests. The military connections between early Christianity and Roman power structures become obvious when examined closely. Many early Christian leaders had served in Roman armies or administrative positions before their religious careers. The organizational principles they brought to church governance reflected military hierarchy and discipline, rather than the egalitarian principles that Jesus supposedly taught. The philosophical foundations of Christian theology drew more heavily from Roman Stoicism than from Jewish wisdom traditions. The ethical systems that Christianity promoted aligned perfectly with Roman civic virtues, while contradicting many Jewish moral principles. This wasn't accidental convergence. It was deliberate design by people who understood exactly what kind of religious system would serve imperial purposes. The textual evidence becomes even more compelling when you examine how Christian scriptures were preserved and transmitted. Instead of following Jewish practices for maintaining sacred texts, Christian manuscripts were copied and distributed using Roman administrative procedures. The quality control, standardization, and distribution networks all reflected imperial organizational capabilities rather than grassroots religious movement resources. The archaeological evidence tells the same story. Early Christian sites don't show the characteristics of persecuted communities hiding from imperial authority. They demonstrate the features of officially sanctioned institutions receiving imperial support. The building materials, construction techniques, and decorative elements all indicate access to resources that only imperial favor could provide. The numismatic evidence reveals imperial connections that traditional Christian history tries to ignore. Coins from the Flavian period carry symbols that would later become central to Christian iconography. The timing of these symbolic appearances coincides exactly with the period when the Gospels were supposedly being written, suggesting coordination between imperial minting authorities and Christian literary production. The linguistic analysis of early Christian texts reveals vocabulary and grammatical structures that match Roman administrative documents from the same period. The technical terminology used to describe Christian rituals and beliefs derives from Roman legal and ceremonial language rather than Jewish religious vocabulary. This suggests authorship by people trained in Roman institutional systems rather than Jewish religious traditions. The psychological techniques embedded in Christian teachings reflect Roman understanding of crowd control and social manipulation rather than Jewish approaches to spiritual development. The emphasis on guilt, fear of punishment, and dependence on priestly mediation served imperial interests in maintaining social order rather than Jewish interests in developing individual relationship with God. The historical timeline of Christian development matches Roman imperial needs rather than natural religious evolution. Each major theological development coincided with specific political challenges that the empire was facing. The solutions that Christian doctrine provided aligned perfectly with what Roman administrators needed to maintain control over diverse populations across vast territories. The geographical distribution of early Christian communities followed Roman trade routes and administrative centers, rather than patterns that would suggest organic religious spread. The timing of Christian establishment in different regions corresponded with Roman military and political priorities rather than evangelistic opportunities or spiritual receptivity. The social composition of early Christian leadership reflected Roman class structures rather than the egalitarian principles that Jesus supposedly taught. The wealthy, educated elite who controlled Christian institutions were the same people who benefited from Roman imperial systems. The poor and oppressed, who supposedly formed Christianity's core constituency, remained largely excluded from positions of authority within the church hierarchy. This evidence doesn't exist in isolation. It forms a coherent pattern that points to a single conclusion. Christianity wasn't the organic growth of a Jewish religious movement that gradually gained Roman acceptance. It was the deliberate creation of Roman imperial strategists who needed a new form of social control that would be more effective than military force alone. The religion that has shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia may be the most successful propaganda operation in human history. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond academic debates about ancient history. If Christianity was indeed engineered as a tool of imperial control, then every institution built upon Christian foundations carries the DNA of that original deception. The churches, schools, governments, and social systems that claim Christian inspiration may be perpetuating forms of control that were designed to serve power rather than truth. But perhaps the most unsettling implication is what this suggests about the nature of belief itself. If billions of people can be convinced to worship what amounts to a Roman emperor in disguise, what other deeply held convictions might be similarly manufactured? In an age of sophisticated media manipulation and psychological operations, the techniques that the Flavians allegedly pioneered 2,000 years ago have been refined into tools of unprecedented power and subtlety. The question isn't just whether Christianity is true in some abstract theological sense. The question is whether we have the intellectual courage to examine our most fundamental beliefs with the same skeptical rigor we apply to obvious propaganda. Because if we can be fooled about something as basic as the origins of our own civilization's dominant religion, what else might we be wrong about? The story of Christianity's creation may be the story of how power learns to disguise itself as love, how authority presents itself as liberation, and how control markets itself as salvation. Understanding this story isn't about destroying faith. It's about recognizing the difference between authentic spiritual seeking and manufactured consent. The truth, as the Gospels themselves promise, has the power to set us free. But first, we have to be willing to question everything we think we know. The mechanics of this deception become even more intricate when we examine the specific literary techniques employed in constructing the Jesus narrative. The authors didn't simply invent a fictional character and hope people would believe it. They employed a sophisticated method known as typological parallelism, a technique that was deeply embedded in Jewish scriptural tradition but had been weaponized for Roman political purposes. To understand how this worked, imagine you're reading two seemingly unrelated stories. But as you progress, you notice that events in the second story mirror those in the first with uncanny precision. Same locations, same sequence of events, same symbolic elements, but with completely different characters and outcomes. This wasn't coincidence. This was the signature of authors' die work while keeping their contemporary who wanted future readers to recognize their Hanaris in the dark. The typological connections between the gospel narratives and Roman military campaigns are so precise, they function like a literary fingerprint. Jesus begins his ministry at the Sea of Galilee, gathering disciples and telling them to become fishers of men. Titus begins his campaign at the same location, gathering soldiers and literally making them fishers of men by spearing Jewish rebels who attempt to escape by swimming across the water. The parallel isn't metaphorical, it's mathematical in its precision. These connections continue throughout both narratives with clockwork regularity. Jesus encounters a man possessed by a legion of demons at Gadara, and these demons are cast into a herd of swine that rush into the sea. Titus fights a battle at the same location where a group of Jewish rebels, described by Josephus as being possessed by a rebellious spirit, are driven into the sea where they drown. The Gospel presents this as exorcism. The history presents it as military victory, but the underlying structure is identical. The sophistication of this technique suggests authors who weren't just familiar with Jewish typological methods, but had mastered them to a degree that would have required years of intensive study. These weren't amateur propagandists trying to cobble together a convincing story. These were literary masters working at the highest levels of ancient scholarship, with access to resources and expertise that only imperial patronage could provide. The timeline of gospel composition reveals another layer of strategic planning that contradicts traditional Christian origin stories. The Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses recording recent memories. They were composed decades after the events they claimed to describe, during a period when the Flavian Dynasty was consolidating its power and establishing its legitimacy as divine rulers. The backdating of the Jesus story by exactly 40 years from the time of its actual composition wasn't arbitrary. In Jewish tradition, 40 years represented a complete generation, the span of time between divine judgment and renewal. By placing Jesus' ministry 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the Gospel authors were suggesting that his teachings had prophetically anticipated and explained this catastrophic event. This timing allowed the Flavians to present themselves not as destroyers of Jewish hopes, but as fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. The same scriptures that had inspired rebellion against Rome were now proving that Rome's victory had been ordained by God himself. The psychological impact of this reversal would have been devastating to any remaining Jewish resistance movements. The language and style of the Gospels provide additional evidence of their artificial construction. While the surface narrative presents simple parables and straightforward teachings, the underlying Greek text employs sophisticated rhetorical devices that were taught in Roman schools of advanced rhetoric. The authors demonstrate familiarity with classical literary techniques, philosophical concepts, and legal terminology that would have been impossible for Galilean fishermen to acquiringly, the Gospels show. More tell detailed knowledge of Roman military procedures, administrative systems, and legal processes that only insiders would have possessed. The trial scenes, the descriptions of crucifixion procedures, the interactions with Roman officials all demonstrate intimate familiarity with imperial bureaucracy. These weren't details that could have been observed from a distance by hostile witnesses. These were insider perspectives provided by people who understood the system from within. The theological architecture of Christianity reveals the same artificial construction. Instead of developing gradually through community discussion and debate, Christian doctrine appeared with fully formed systematic theology that addressed questions most religious movements don't encounter until centuries of development. The Trinity, the nature of salvation, the structure of church hierarchy, the relationship between faith and works, all emerged as sophisticated theological systems, that match the complexity of Roman legal and philosophical frameworks. The speed of this theological development becomes even more suspicious when compared to other religious movements of the same period. Genuine grassroots religions typically require generations to develop complex doctrinal systems. Christianity appeared with theological sophistication that suggested careful planning and professional construction rather than organic evolution through community experience. The social engineering aspects of Christian teaching reveal perhaps the most compelling evidence of Roman authorship. Every major ethical teaching in Christianity served Roman imperial interests while contradicting Jewish resistance traditions. The Sermon on the Mount wasn't a collection of spiritual insights. It was a manual for creating compliant subjects who would serve imperial power while believing they were following divine command. Turn the other cheek. Don't resist evil. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Pay your taxes. Obey government authority. These weren't random moral teachings. They were specific responses to the forms of resistance that Jewish rebels had been using against Roman occupation. Each commandment directly countered a strategy that had been employed in the Jewish revolt. The psychological sophistication of this approach reveals understanding of human motivation that went far beyond primitive propaganda. The authors knew that direct commands to submit to Roman authority would be rejected by Jewish audiences. But the same commands, when presented as divine revelation through a Jewish Messiah, could be accepted as religious truth rather than political manipulation. The economic implications of Christian teaching served Roman interests with equal precision. Where Jewish law included provisions for debt forgiveness, land redistribution, and economic justice that threatened imperial wealth extraction, Christian teaching emphasized spiritual rather than material concerns. The poor were told to accept their poverty as divinely ordained, while the rich were assured that their wealth didn't prevent salvation as long as they supported the church. The transformation of Jewish messianic expectations from political liberation to spiritual salvation eliminated the theological foundation for resistance movements. Instead of expecting God to establish earthly justice through military victory, Christians were taught to await heavenly rewards that would come only after death. This theological shift removed any religious justification for challenging Roman rule, while maintaining the emotional appeal of messianic hope. The family connections between early Christian leaders and Roman imperial circles become obvious when examined systematically. Many of the first bishops and saints came from the same aristocratic families that had previously served as pagan priests or Roman administrators. The transition from serving Jupiter to serving Jesus wasn't a spiritual conversion. It was a career change that allowed the same elite families to maintain their privileged positions under a new religious system. The financial resources that supported early Christian expansion came from sources that would have been impossible for a genuinely grassroots movement to access. The construction of major churches, the copying and distribution of manuscripts, the support of full-time clergy, the establishment of educational institutions all required funding levels that only imperial patronage or wealthy family sponsorship could provide. The archaeological evidence from early Christian sites confirms this pattern of elite support. Instead of the humble meeting places that would be expected from a persecuted religious movement, early Christian buildings demonstrate access to skilled architects, expensive materials, and sophisticated construction techniques. These weren't communities hiding from imperial authority. These were institutions receiving imperial support. The artistic and symbolic elements that became central to Christian identity borrowed heavily from existing Roman imperial iconography. The fish symbol, the anchor, the olive branch, the star all appeared on Flavian coins before they became Christian symbols. The cross itself, supposedly representing Christ's crucifixion, was already an established symbol of Roman imperial authority. The adoption of these symbols wasn't spiritual inspiration. It was brand recognition. designed to create subconscious associations between Christian worship and Roman power. The legal frameworks that governed early Christian communities followed Roman administrative models rather than Jewish religious precedents. Church hierarchy mirrored imperial bureaucracy. Procedures for selecting leaders, resolving disputes, and managing resources all reflected Roman institutional experience rather than Jewish community traditions. This wasn't accidental convergence. It was deliberate design by people who understood exactly how to create stable, controllable organizations. The educational systems that preserved and transmitted Christian teachings were modeled on Roman schools rather than Jewish study methods. The curriculum, pedagogical approaches, and intellectual frameworks all derived from Roman academic institutions. Even the languages used for Christian scholarship followed Roman rather than Jewish preferences, with Latin eventually replacing Greek as the dominant language of Christian learning. The missionary strategies that spread Christianity throughout the empire followed Roman administrative networks rather than natural religious dissemination patterns. Christian communities appeared first in major Roman cities and administrative centers, then spread along Roman roads and trade routes. The timing and geographical distribution of Christian expansion matched Roman political and military priorities rather than evangelistic opportunities. The integration of Christian festivals with existing Roman celebrations reveals the same strategic planning. Instead of developing uniquely Christian calendar observances, the new religion absorbed existing pagan holidays and gave them Christian meanings. This wasn't organic cultural evolution. It was deliberate policy designed to minimize disruption to establish social patterns while redirecting their significance toward Roman imperial goals. The transformation of Christian worship from Jewish synagogue models to Roman temple practices serves the same purpose. Instead of maintaining Jewish traditions of communal study and discussion, Christian worship emphasized priestly authority, ritualistic ceremony, and passive congregation participation that mirrored Roman religious observances. The faithful were transformed from active participants in their own spiritual development into passive consumers of priestly services. The textual transmission of Christian scriptures followed Roman administrative procedures rather than Jewish methods for preserving sacred texts. The quality control, standardization, and distribution networks all reflected imperial organizational capabilities. The speed and efficiency of manuscript production and dissemination would have been impossible without access to Roman infrastructure and resources. The linguistic analysis of early Christian documents reveals vocabulary and grammatical structures that match Roman administrative and legal documents from the same period. The technical terminology used to describe Christian beliefs and practices derives from Roman ceremonial and legal language rather than Jewish religious vocabulary. This suggests authorship by people trained in Roman institutional systems rather than Jewish religious traditions. The philosophical foundations of Christian ethics draw more heavily from Roman Stoicism than from Jewish wisdom traditions. The moral systems that Christianity promoted aligned with Roman civic virtues while contradicting many Jewish ethical principles. The emphasis on individual submission to authority rather than communal resistance to injustice served Roman political interests while undermining Jewish cultural values. The military connections between early Christian leaders and Roman power structures become obvious when their backgrounds are examined. Many bishops and prominent Christians had served in Roman armies or administrative positions before their religious careers. The organizational principles they brought to church governance reflected military hierarchy and discipline, rather than the egalitarian principles that Jesus supposedly taught. The economic structures that supported Christian communities integrated seamlessly with Roman commercial networks, rather than developing alternative systems based on Jewish principles of economic justice. Christian institutions adopted Roman practices of private property, wage labor, and commercial exchange that supported imperial economic interests rather than challenging them. The social composition of early Christian leadership reflected Roman class structures rather than Jewish egalitarian traditions. The wealthy, educated elite who controlled Christian institutions were the same people who benefited from Roman imperial systems. The poor and oppressed who supposedly formed Christianity's core constituency remained largely excluded from positions of real authority within church hierarchy. The geographical spread of Christianity reveals patterns that confirm artificial rather than organic origins. Instead of growing naturally outward from Palestine, Christian communities appeared almost simultaneously in major Roman cities throughout the empire. This distribution pattern matches Roman administrative planning rather than natural religious dissemination. The technological resources required for early Christian manuscript production and distribution would have been impossible for grassroots religious movements to access. The quality of parchment, ink, and copying techniques all required access to Roman industrial and commercial networks. The speed of manuscript reproduction and circulation demonstrates coordination with imperial communication systems. The preservation of Christian texts through periods of supposed persecution becomes suspicious when examined closely. While other religious and political movements from the same period lost most of their literature to Roman suppression, Christian documents survived in remarkable quantity and quality. This suggests protection rather than persecution from imperial authorities. The legal privileges that Christian communities eventually received didn't represent a sudden change in Roman policy toward a previously persecuted religion. They represented the culmination of a long-term plan to establish Christianity as an official tool of imperial control. The transformation from supposed persecution to imperial patronage happened too smoothly to represent genuine policy reversal. The theological debates that supposedly divided early Christian communities served Roman political purposes by creating the appearance of genuine religious development, while maintaining imperial control over the process. The councils that determined Christian doctrine were dominated by imperial representatives who ensured that theological decisions served Roman interests rather than threatening them. The martyrdom narratives that form such a central part of Christian tradition begin to look very different when examined as literary constructions rather than historical records. Many of these stories were created centuries after the alleged events by church historians, who needed to establish their religion's credentials as a persecuted faith. The martyrdom accounts served the same propagandistic purposes as the gospel stories themselves. The transformation of Jesus from Jewish rabbi to Roman deity wasn't a gradual process of theological evolution. It was a systematic campaign of character reconstruction designed to create a religious figure who would command Jewish respect while serving Roman purposes. The divine Jesus who emerged from this process bore little resemblance to any historical Jewish teacher, but perfectly matched Roman imperial needs. The ultimate success of this operation exceeded even its creator's wildest expectations. Not only did Christianity neutralize Jewish resistance to Roman rule, it eventually became the dominant religion of the entire Western world. The Flavian dynasty that allegedly created Christianity has been forgotten by most people, but their religious creation continues to shape civilization 2,000 years later. The implications of this theory extend far beyond ancient history into contemporary questions about power, belief, and social control. If Christianity was indeed engineered as a tool of imperial manipulation, then every institution built upon Christian foundations may be perpetuating forms of control that were designed to serve authority rather than truth. The churches, schools, governments, and social systems that claim Christian inspiration might be unconsciously maintaining systems of dominance that their founders never intended. But perhaps the most disturbing implication concerns the nature of belief itself. If billions of people can be convinced to worship what amounts to a literary construction designed to serve political purposes, what does that suggest about human capacity for critical thinking? In an age of sophisticated media manipulation and psychological operations, the techniques that the Flavians allegedly pioneered have been refined into tools of unprecedented subtlety and power. The question isn't just whether Christianity is historically accurate. The question is whether we have the intellectual courage to examine our most fundamental assumptions with the same skeptical rigor we apply to obvious propaganda. Because if we can be deceived about something as basic as the origins of our civilization's dominant religion, what other cherished beliefs might be equally manufactured? The story of Christianity's alleged creation reveals how power learns to disguise itself as love, how authority presents itself as liberation, and how control markets itself as salvation. Understanding this dynamic isn't about destroying faith or promoting atheism. It's about developing the capacity to distinguish between authentic spiritual seeking and manufactured consent. The evidence continues to accumulate, pointing toward conclusions that challenge everything most people believe about the foundations of Western civilization. The rabbit hole goes deeper than anyone imagined, and what lies at the bottom might transform our understanding of how truth, power, and belief interact in human societies. The implications stretch from ancient Rome to modern America, from imperial palaces to contemporary churches, from propaganda techniques that shaped the ancient world to media manipulation that shapes our world today. The financial infrastructure that enabled this massive propaganda operation reveals the true scope of what scholars argue was the ancient world's most ambitious psychological warfare campaign. The Flavian dynasty didn't just possess political power. They controlled the economic networks, trade routes, and commercial relationships that could transform a local religious movement into a global phenomenon within a single generation. Consider the logistics involved in producing and distributing thousands of manuscript copies across an empire that stretched from Britain to North Africa. This wasn't a grassroots movement spreading through word of mouth among poor fishermen. This was an industrial-scale publishing operation that required access to specialized materials, trained scribes, and transportation networks that only imperial resources could provide. The papyrus alone would have cost a fortune. The highest quality writing material came from Egypt, which was directly controlled by Rome as the emperor's personal province. The ink, made from expensive imported materials, had to be prepared by skilled craftsmen. The scribes who could write in multiple languages and reproduce complex Greek texts were educated professionals who commanded substantial wages. Even the wooden storage containers and protective wrappings represented significant investments. But the most revealing aspect of this operation was its coordination across vast distances. Christian communities didn't emerge randomly throughout the empire. They appeared simultaneously in major administrative centers, commercial hubs, and military strongholds where Roman authority was most firmly established. This pattern suggests central planning and resource allocation that could only have come from imperial headquarters. The speed of Christian expansion becomes even more suspicious when compared to other religious movements of the same period. Genuine grassroots religions typically require generations to spread beyond their original communities. They face natural obstacles like language barriers, cultural differences, and resistance from established religious authorities. Christianity, by contrast, seemed to encounter remarkably few of these obstacles, almost as if the path had been prepared in advance. The theological sophistication that Christianity displayed from its earliest phases also defies natural religious evolution. Most new religious movements begin with simple, emotionally compelling messages that gradually develop more complex doctrinal systems through community discussion and debate. Christianity appeared with fully formed, systematic theology that addressed sophisticated philosophical questions most religions don't encounter until centuries of development. The Trinity doctrine, for example, represents one of the most complex theological concepts in human religious history. It attempts to reconcile monotheistic belief with the worship of multiple divine figures through philosophical distinctions that require advanced training to understand. Yet this doctrine wasn't developed gradually through theological debate. It appeared in Christian teaching from the earliest phases. suggesting professional theological construction rather than organic religious growth. The legal frameworks that governed early Christian communities reveal the same artificial origins. Instead of developing unique systems based on Jesus' supposed teachings about love, forgiveness, and community, Christian institutions adopted Roman administrative procedures wholesale. Church hierarchy mirrored imperial bureaucracy. Judicial processes followed Roman legal precedents. Financial management systems copied imperial accounting methods. Even the architectural styles used for early Christian buildings demonstrate imperial influence rather than organic religious development. The basilica form that became standard for Christian churches wasn't derived from Jewish synagogue designs or invented by Christian communities. It was adapted directly from Roman civic architecture, specifically the buildings used for imperial courts and administrative functions. The symbolism embedded in Christian art and ritual provides another layer of evidence for Roman authorship. The fish symbol that became so central to Christian identity had appeared on Flavian Dynasty coins decades before it became associated with Jesus. The anchor, representing hope, was a standard element of Roman naval insignia. The olive branch, signifying peace, was used throughout Roman imperial propaganda to represent the benefits. The cross itself, supposedly representing Christ's crucifixion, carried meanings in Roman culture that had nothing to do with execution. It was an ancient symbol of divine authority that appeared in Roman religious contexts long before Christianity emerged. The adoption of these pre-existing symbols wasn't spiritual inspiration. It was brand management designed to create subconscious associations between Christian worship and Roman imperial power. The timing of Christian festival celebrations reveals the same strategic planning. Instead of developing commemorations based on events from Jesus' supposed life or Jewish religious calendar, Christianity absorbed existing Roman holidays and gave them new meanings. The winter solstice celebration became Christmas. Spring fertility festivals became Easter. Summer harvest celebrations became Pentecost. This wasn't accidental cultural blending. It was deliberate policy designed to minimize disruption to established social patterns while redirecting their spiritual significance toward Roman political goals. People could continue celebrating the same festivals they had always observed, but now these celebrations reinforce loyalty to Roman authority instead of competing with it. The educational systems that transmitted Christian teaching followed Roman pedagogical models rather than Jewish learning traditions. Where Jewish education emphasized community discussion, questioning, and debate, Christian instruction emphasized passive reception of authoritative teaching. Students were expected to memorize and repeat rather than analyze and challenge. This shift served Roman interests by creating populations trained to accept authority without question. The missionary strategies that spread Christianity throughout the empire reveal coordination that would have been impossible for independent religious communities to achieve. Christian evangelists appeared in distant provinces with remarkable timing, often arriving just as Roman administrative or military priorities made their message most useful to imperial goals. In Britain, Christian missionaries arrived during periods when Roman authorities needed to pacify Celtic populations that had been resisting cultural assimilation. In North Africa, Christianity expanded during campaigns to suppress local independence movements. In Asia Minor, Christian communities emerged in regions where Roman administrators were struggling to maintain control over diverse ethnic and religious groups. The language policies that Christianity promoted served Roman imperial interests with surgical precision. Instead of preserving Aramaic, the language Jesus supposedly spoke, or Hebrew, the language of Jewish scripture, Christianity adopted Greek and later Latin as its sacred languages. This shift eliminated linguistic connections to Jewish resistance literature, while creating bonds with Roman administrative culture. The philosophical foundations of Christian ethics drew selectively from existing moral systems in ways that served Roman political purposes. Where Stoic philosophy taught individual virtue and personal responsibility, Christianity emphasized submission to authority and acceptance of suffering. Where Jewish ethics promoted social justice and resistance to oppression, Christian teaching encouraged patience and forgiveness toward oppressors. The economic implications of Christian doctrine eliminated theological justifications for challenging Roman wealth extraction systems. Where Jewish law included provisions for debt forgiveness, land redistribution, and limits on economic exploitation, Christian teaching spiritualized poverty and wealth as divine conditions that shouldn't be altered through human action. The military connections between Christian leadership and Roman power structures become obvious when their backgrounds are examined systematically. Many of the first bishops had served in Roman armies or administrative positions before their religious careers. They brought organizational principles from imperial service that shaped Christian institutions according to Roman bureaucratic models. The archaeological evidence from early Christian sites confirms patterns of imperial support, rather than grassroots religious development. Building materials, construction techniques, and decorative elements all indicate access to resources that only official patronage could provide. These weren't communities hiding from persecution. These were institutions receiving government sponsorship. The manuscript tradition that preserved Christian texts shows the same imperial characteristics. The quality of materials, copying techniques, and distribution networks all required access to Roman industrial and commercial systems. The speed and efficiency of Christian manuscript production would have been impossible for independent religious communities to achieve. The legal privileges that Christian institutions eventually received didn't represent sudden policy changes toward a previously persecuted religion. They represented the culmination of long-term plans to establish Christianity as an official tool of social control. The transformation from supposed persecution to imperial patronage happened too smoothly to represent genuine policy reversal. The theological debates that supposedly divided early Christian communities served Roman political purposes by creating the appearance of genuine religious development while maintaining imperial control over the process. The councils that determined Christian doctrine were dominated by Roman representatives who ensured that theological decisions aligned with imperial interests. The martyrdom narratives that became central to Christian identity begin to look very different when examined as literary constructions rather than historical records. These stories were created to establish Christianity's credentials as a persecuted faith, while actually serving the same propagandistic functions as the gospel accounts themselves. The transformation of regional Christian variations into a unified imperial religion reveals the same top-down control that characterized the entire operation. Instead of allowing diverse Christian communities to develop their own theological and liturgical traditions, Roman authorities imposed standardization that eliminated local autonomy and created centralized control systems. The success of this operation exceeded anything its alleged creators could have anticipated. Not only did Christianity neutralize Jewish resistance to Roman rule, it eventually became the foundation for European civilization itself. The religious system that may have been designed as a temporary political expedient became the dominant spiritual framework for the Western world. The implications of this theory stretch far beyond academic debates about ancient history. If Christianity was indeed engineered as a tool of imperial control, then every institution built upon Christian foundations carries the genetic code of that original deception. The governments, schools, legal systems, and social structures that claim Christian inspiration may be unconsciously perpetuating control mechanisms that were designed to serve power rather than truth. But perhaps the most unsettling implication concerns what this suggests about human susceptibility to sophisticated propaganda. If billions of people across multiple generations can be convinced to worship what amounts to a literary construction designed for political purposes, what does that reveal about our capacity for independent critical thinking? The techniques that the Flavians allegedly pioneered 2,000 years ago have been refined and perfected in our modern era. The same psychological principles that supposedly transformed rebellious Jewish Messiah expectations into pacifist Christian submission continue to operate in contemporary media, education, and political systems. The methods may have evolved, but the underlying dynamics remain unchanged. The question isn't just whether Christianity's origins are what we've been told. The question is whether we have the intellectual courage to examine our most fundamental beliefs with the same skeptical rigor we would apply to obvious propaganda from foreign governments or commercial advertisers. Because if we can be deceived about something as foundational as the origins of our civilization's dominant religion, what other cherished assumptions might be equally manufactured? The story of Christianity's alleged creation reveals timeless patterns in how power operates across cultures and centuries. Authority learns to disguise itself as liberation. Control markets itself as salvation. Manipulation presents itself as divine revelation. Understanding these dynamics isn't about attacking faith or promoting cynicism. It's about developing the capacity to distinguish between authentic spiritual seeking and manufactured consent. The evidence continues to accumulate from multiple disciplines, pointing toward conclusions that challenge everything most people believe about the foundations of Western thought. Archaeological discoveries, linguistic analysis, literary criticism, and historical investigation all converge on the same disturbing possibility. The religion that has shaped our world for 2 millennia may be the most successful propaganda operation in human history. The rabbit hole goes deeper than anyone imagined, and what lies at the bottom might fundamentally transform our understanding of truth, power, and belief in human societies. The implications stretch from ancient imperial palaces to modern corporate boardrooms, from Roman propaganda techniques to contemporary media manipulation, from the control of ancient populations to the influence systems that shape our world today. This isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting eternal struggles between those who seek to control and those who yearn to be free. The question isn't whether we can handle the truth about Christianity's origins. The question is whether we can afford to remain ignorant of how easily human beings can be convinced to worship their own chains when those chains are presented as the keys to salvation. The psychological warfare tactics embedded within early Christian doctrine reveal layers of manipulation so sophisticated they make modern propaganda techniques look primitive by comparison. When you examine the specific commands that Jesus allegedly gave his followers, each one serves as a precise counter-strategy to forms of resistance that Jewish rebels had been using against Roman occupation. Consider the famous instruction to turn the other cheek. This wasn't a random moral teaching about forgiveness. It was a specific response to Jewish resistance fighters who had been using guerrilla tactics against Roman soldiers. When someone strikes your right cheek with the back of their hand, they're asserting dominance as a superior over an inferior. The natural human response is to fight back or flee. But Jesus commands his followers to offer the left cheek as well, forcing the striker to use their palm, which in Roman culture indicated striking an equal rather than a subordinate. This seems like clever resistance at first glance, but look deeper. The instruction doesn't actually challenge Roman authority or change the power dynamic. It simply transforms physical resistance into symbolic gesture while leaving the underlying oppression completely intact. The Roman soldier still has the power. The Jewish victim still suffers. But now that suffering has been reframed as spiritual victory rather than political defeat, the command to love your enemies operates through the same psychological mechanism. Jewish resistance literature was filled with prayers for God's vengeance against foreign oppressors. Psalms called for divine judgment. Prophetic texts promised that Israel's enemies would be crushed and scattered. This religious foundation provided emotional and spiritual fuel for armed resistance movements. Christianity inverted this completely. Instead of expecting God to destroy their enemies, followers were commanded to love them. Instead of praying for divine vengeance, They were told to pray for their oppressors' welfare. The emotional energy that had previously powered resistance movements was now being channeled into acceptance and submission. The genius of this approach lies in how it maintained the appearance of moral superiority while eliminating any practical threat to Roman control. Christians could feel spiritually elevated above their oppressors while remaining politically powerless. They could maintain their sense of divine favor while abandoning any expectation that this favor would manifest in earthly liberation. The instruction to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's represents perhaps the most audacious piece of theological engineering in the entire Christian system. Jewish law contained specific provisions limiting the authority of earthly rulers. Kings were subject to divine law. Political power was constrained by religious principle. The idea that any human authority could claim unlimited obedience was fundamentally incompatible with Jewish theological tradition. But Jesus allegedly teaches his followers to separate religious and political obligations in ways that give Caesar unlimited authority over material concerns, while restricting God's authority to purely spiritual matters. This wasn't a clever compromise between competing claims. This was a surrender of divine authority over earthly affairs that eliminated any religious justification for political resistance. The parable of the talents reveals the same pattern of psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual teaching. On the surface, it appears to encourage initiative and responsibility, but examine the underlying message more carefully. The master represents authority. The servants represent subjects. The talents represent resources that belong to the master, but are temporarily entrusted to servants for management. The servant who buries his talent rather than investing it is condemned not for theft or dishonesty, but for failing to multiply his master's wealth. The message is clear. Subjects exist to serve authority's interests, not their own. Any resources they control are actually the property of their superiors. Failure to actively increase the master's wealth, even through risk-taking that could result in loss, is worthy of punishment. This parable wasn't teaching spiritual principles about using God-given abilities. It was programming economic attitudes that would make subjects more willing to accept their role in systems of wealth extraction. The faithful servant doesn't question why the master owns everything while servants own nothing. They don't ask whether the distribution of resources is just. They simply focus on maximizing returns for their superior. The Beatitudes represent perhaps the most sophisticated example of psychological manipulation in the entire Christian system. Each blessing takes a condition that should naturally inspire resistance or demand for change, and transforms it into a virtue that should be passively accepted. Blessed are the poor in spirit doesn't encourage material poverty. It promotes intellectual poverty. Those who don't think too deeply about their circumstances, who don't question authority, who remain spiritually humble and intellectually passive, are promised heavenly rewards. The message is clear. Don't be too smart, don't ask too many questions, and don't expect too much from life. Blessed are those who mourn, transforms grief into virtue. Instead of anger at injustice that causes suffering, followers are taught that sadness itself is spiritually beneficial. The emotional energy that could fuel demands for change is redirected into passive acceptance of loss and suffering as divinely ordained experiences. Blessed are the meek explicitly promises that submission will eventually be rewarded with power, but only in some future dispensation that conveniently never arrives. The meek can maintain hope for eventual inheritance while remaining powerless in the present. This psychological trick allows people to feel like future winners while accepting current defeat. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, channels the desire for justice away from earthly action towards spiritual longing. Instead of working to establish just systems in the present world, followers are taught to yearn for righteousness as an abstract spiritual condition that will only be satisfied in an afterlife they can never verify. The Lord's Prayer contains the same psychological programming embedded in language so familiar that most people never analyze its actual content. Give us this day our daily bread sounds like a request for provision, but it actually programs economic dependence. Instead of expecting to control their own resources or plan for their own security, followers are taught to remain dependent on daily provision from external authority. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Eliminates any concept of justice or accountability. Financial obligations that could be legally enforced are transformed into moral obligations that can be spiritually released. This teaching would have been particularly useful to Roman authorities who were extracting wealth from conquered territories through taxation and tribute systems that local populations might otherwise resist. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil programs, followers, to see themselves as passive recipients of moral guidance rather than active agents capable of making ethical decisions. Instead of developing personal moral reasoning abilities, they're taught to depend on external authority for guidance about right and wrong. The resurrection narrative itself serves psychological functions that go far beyond religious belief. By placing the ultimate validation of Jesus' teachings in an event that can never be verified or repeated, the entire system becomes immune to empirical challenge. Followers can maintain absolute confidence in beliefs that have no testable content. But more importantly, the resurrection promise programs followers to accept present suffering in exchange for future reward that can never be confirmed until after death. This psychological mechanism allows people to endure unlimited exploitation while maintaining hope for eventual compensation. It's the perfect formula for creating compliant populations who will accept any amount of present injustice in exchange for promised future vindication. The theological framework that emerged from these teachings created populations ideally suited for imperial control. Christians were programmed to be honest, hard-working, obedient to authority, accepting of their social position, grateful for minimal provisions, forgiving of those who exploited them, and hopeful about rewards they would never live to collect. From a Roman imperial perspective, Christianity represented the perfect solution to the problem of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Instead of requiring expensive military occupation and constant surveillance, Christian populations would essentially govern themselves according to principles that served imperial interests while believing they were serving divine purposes. The missionary expansion of Christianity followed patterns that confirm this imperial functionality. Christian communities appeared first in areas where Roman authorities were struggling to maintain control through military means alone. The new religion provided a supplementary control mechanism that was far more cost-effective than legions and far more psychologically penetrating than fear-based compliance. The transformation of local religious traditions into Christian forms followed the same strategic pattern throughout the empire. Instead of suppressing indigenous beliefs that might inspire resistance, Christianity absorbed and redirected them toward imperial purposes. Local deities became Christian saints. Traditional festivals became Christian holy days. Sacred sites became Christian churches. The familiar forms were preserved while their meaning was fundamentally altered. This process wasn't organic religious evolution. It was systematic cultural engineering conducted by people who understood exactly what they were trying to achieve. The result was populations who maintained emotional connections to their traditional spiritual practices while unknowingly serving the political interests of their conquerors. The economic implications of Christian doctrine reveal the same imperial functionality. Where traditional Jewish law included provisions for debt forgiveness, land redistribution, and limits on wealth accumulation, Christian teaching spiritualized economic relationships in ways that eliminated challenges to existing power structures. The poor were taught that their poverty was spiritually beneficial and would be rewarded in heaven. The wealthy were assured that their riches didn't prevent salvation as long as they supported church activities. Economic inequality was transformed from a social problem requiring solution into a divine arrangement requiring acceptance. The legal frameworks that developed around Christian communities served imperial interests with equal precision. Instead of maintaining Jewish traditions of community self-governance and resistance to unjust authority, Christian legal systems emphasized submission to established power structures and acceptance of hierarchical social organization. Church courts handled disputes according to principles that reinforced rather than challenged imperial social arrangements. Christian legal procedures trained populations to accept authoritative decision-making rather than developing their own capacity for democratic self-governance. The result was communities perfectly adapted to function within imperial administrative systems. The educational approaches that transmitted Christian teaching eliminated the critical thinking skills that might threaten imperial control. Where Jewish education traditionally encouraged questioning, debate, and independent interpretation of sacred texts, Christian instruction emphasized memorization, obedience, and acceptance of authoritative interpretation. Students were taught to receive truth from above, rather than discover it through investigation. They learned to value faith over evidence, submission over independence, and humility over confidence. These educational patterns produce populations ideally suited for imperial subjects who would accept authority without question and perform assigned roles without rebellion. The artistic and cultural expressions that developed around Christianity reinforced the same psychological patterns. Christian art depicted divine authority as remote, powerful, and demanding submission. Human figures were portrayed as small, humble, and dependent. The visual messages reinforced theological teachings about the proper relationship between authority and subjects. Christian music developed forms that emphasized collective participation in predetermined patterns rather than individual expression or creative innovation. Congregational singing trained people to move together in harmony while following leadership they couldn't see. The psychological lessons extended far beyond religious worship into general attitudes towards social organization. The architectural forms used for Christian buildings programmed spatial relationships that reinforced hierarchical social structures. Churches were designed with clear distinctions between clergy and congregation, between altar and audience, between sacred and profane spaces. The physical environment taught people their proper place in social hierarchies, while making that positioning feel natural and divinely ordained. The calendar systems that organized Christian communities eliminated connections to natural cycles or local traditions that might inspire independent thinking. Instead of following seasonal rhythms or regional festivals that connected people to their immediate environment, Christian calendars focused attention on events from distant times and places that could only be interpreted through authorized religious instruction. The linguistic policies that Christianity promoted served imperial purposes by eliminating local languages that might preserve independent cultural traditions. Greek and Latin became the languages of Christian scholarship, creating barriers between religious authority and common populations while connecting Christian leadership to imperial administrative systems. The philosophical frameworks that supported Christian theology drew selectively from existing intellectual traditions in ways that supported rather than challenged imperial power structures. Where classical philosophy had encouraged independent reasoning and critical analysis, Christian philosophy emphasized faith-based acceptance of revealed truth. The result was intellectual systems perfectly designed to produce compliant populations who would accept authority without question, perform assigned social roles without rebellion, and maintain hope for eventual reward while enduring unlimited present suffering. From the perspective of imperial control, Christianity represented the ultimate psychological weapon, a belief system that made people grateful for their own oppression. The success of this system exceeded anything its alleged creators could have imagined. Not only did Christianity eliminate Jewish resistance to Roman rule, it eventually became the foundation for European civilization itself. The psychological patterns that were supposedly designed as temporary political expedients became permanent features of Western culture. The implications stretch far beyond ancient history into contemporary questions about power, belief, and social control. If Christianity was indeed engineered as a tool of imperial manipulation, then every institution built upon Christian foundations may be unconsciously perpetuating control mechanisms that were designed to serve authority rather than human flourishing. The techniques that were allegedly pioneered 2,000 years ago continue to operate in modern political, educational, and media systems. The same psychological principles that supposedly transformed rebellious Jewish populations into compliant Christian subjects are still being used to shape contemporary attitudes toward authority, economic inequality, and social justice. Understanding this history isn't about attacking faith or promoting cynicism. It's about developing the capacity to recognize when spiritual language is being used to serve political purposes, when religious authority is being employed to prevent rather than promote human development, and when beliefs that claim to offer liberation are actually designed to maintain control. The evidence continues to accumulate from multiple directions, all pointing toward the same unsettling conclusion. The religion that has shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia may represent the most successful propaganda operation in human history. And if that's true, then everything we think we know about the relationship between faith and freedom, between spiritual authority and human dignity, between divine will and earthly power, may need to be completely reconsidered. The rabbit hole goes deeper than anyone wants to admit, and what lies at the bottom might transform not just our understanding of the past, but our capacity to navigate the present and shape the future. Because the same dynamics that allegedly created Christianity continue to operate in our world today, using the same psychological techniques to maintain the same patterns of control, wrapped in new languages but serving the same eternal purposes. The question isn't whether we can handle the truth about Christianity's origins. The question is whether we can afford to remain ignorant of how power learns to disguise itself as love, how control markets itself as salvation, and how the deepest human longings for meaning and transcendence can be weaponized against the very people who feel them most deeply. The implications of this possibility extend into every corner of human experience, challenging not just what we believe about the past, but how we understand the present and what we can hope for the future. The psychological architecture becomes even more intricate when you examine how early Christian communities were structured to maximize imperial control while maintaining the illusion of spiritual freedom. These weren't organic religious gatherings emerging from grassroots faith. They were carefully engineered social experiments designed to test the most effective methods of population management through religious belief. The hierarchical structure that emerged in Christian communities didn't develop naturally through community consensus or spiritual discernment. It was imposed from above, using organizational principles lifted directly from Roman military and administrative systems. The bishops weren't chosen by their congregations based on spiritual wisdom or moral character. They were appointed by Roman officials based on their demonstrated loyalty to imperial interests and their ability to maintain order among potentially rebellious populations. This ecclesiastical hierarchy served multiple functions that went far beyond religious administration. It created clear chains of command that could be used to disseminate imperial policy throughout Christian communities. It established systems of surveillance and reporting that allowed Roman authorities to monitor local populations through religious networks. And it provided mechanisms for identifying and isolating individuals who might pose threats to imperial stability. The confession system that became central to Christian practice represents one of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations in human history. Under the guise of spiritual cleansing, Roman authorities gained access to the private thoughts, plans, and relationships of entire populations. Christians were programmed to voluntarily reveal their deepest secrets to religious authorities who were ultimately accountable to imperial power rather than divine mandate. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond information collection. When people regularly confess their thoughts and actions to authority figures, they internalize surveillance as a normal part of existence. They begin to monitor their own behavior according to standards set by those in power. They develop internal censorship mechanisms that prevent them from even thinking thoughts that might be considered rebellious or inappropriate. The concept of sin itself served imperial purposes by creating artificial guilt about natural human responses to injustice and oppression. Anger at exploitation became the sin of wrath. Desire for fair distribution of resources became the sin of envy. Questioning authority became the sin of pride. Natural human reactions to unjust treatment were redefined as moral failures requiring forgiveness and correction, rather than legitimate responses requiring action and change. The sacramental system that developed around these concepts created lifetime dependencies on religious institutions that served imperial interests. Baptism wasn't just a symbolic ritual. It was enrollment in a control system that would monitor and direct behavior from birth to death. Marriage wasn't just a personal relationship. It was a social contract that reinforced imperial family structures and economic arrangements. The most revealing aspect of this system was how it handled death and burial. Instead of allowing families and communities to develop their own traditions for honoring the deceased and processing grief, Christianity imposed standardized procedures that reinforced imperial social arrangements, even beyond the grave. The promise of resurrection wasn't just theological comfort. It was psychological programming that encouraged people to accept present injustice in exchange for future reward that could never be verified. The missionary strategies that spread Christianity throughout the empire reveal coordination and resources that would have been impossible for independent religious communities to achieve. Christian evangelists didn't wander randomly through foreign territories, hoping to find receptive audiences. They followed carefully planned routes that corresponded with Roman military campaigns, trade networks, and administrative priorities. The timing of Christian expansion in different regions matches Roman political needs with suspicious precision. In areas where local populations were resisting cultural assimilation, Christianity appeared with messages about the benefits of peace and submission. In regions where economic exploitation was generating unrest, Christian communities emerged, teaching that poverty was spiritually beneficial and wealth was morally neutral. The linguistic patterns in early Christian literature reveal authorship by people trained in Roman educational systems rather than Jewish religious traditions. The vocabulary, grammatical structures, and rhetorical techniques all demonstrate familiarity with classical Roman literary conventions. More tellingly, the theological concepts employed in Christian texts draw heavily from Roman legal and philosophical frameworks rather than Jewish wisdom traditions. The speed with which complex Christian doctrinal systems appeared throughout the empire defies natural religious development. Sophisticated theological frameworks that should have required generations of community discussion and debate emerged almost simultaneously in distant provinces with remarkable consistency. This uniformity suggests central planning and professional coordination rather than organic spiritual evolution. The economic structures that supported early Christian expansion required resources that only imperial patronage could provide. The construction of churches, the copying and distribution of manuscripts, the support of full-time clergy, and the establishment of educational institutions all demanded funding levels that would have been impossible for grassroots religious movements to generate. The archaeological evidence from early Christian sites confirms these patterns of elite support. Building materials, construction techniques, and decorative elements all indicate access to skilled craftsmen, expensive materials, and sophisticated architectural planning. These weren't communities hiding from persecution. These were institutions receiving substantial financial backing from powerful sources. The artistic symbolism that became central to Christian identity borrowed extensively from existing Roman imperial iconography. The fish, anchor, olive branch, and star symbols that supposedly represented Christian concepts had all appeared previously on Flavian Dynasty coins and official Roman documents. The cross itself, allegedly representing Christ's crucifixion, was already an established symbol of Roman imperial authority before it became associated with Christianity. The calendar systems that organized Christian communities eliminated connections to natural cycles and local traditions that might inspire independent thinking. Instead of following seasonal rhythms or regional festivals that connected people to their immediate environment, Christian calendars focused attention on events from distant times and places that could only be interpreted through authorized religious instruction. The legal frameworks that governed Christian communities followed Roman administrative models rather than Jewish religious precedents. Procedures for selecting leaders, resolving disputes, and managing resources all reflected Roman institutional experience rather than Jewish community traditions. Church law became an extension of imperial law disguised as divine revelation. The educational systems that preserved and transmitted Christian teachings were designed to eliminate critical thinking skills that might threaten imperial control. Where Jewish education traditionally encouraged questioning, debate, and independent interpretation of sacred texts, Christian instruction emphasized memorization, obedience, and acceptance of authoritative teaching. Students were trained to receive truth from religious authorities, rather than discover it through investigation and analysis. They learned to value faith over evidence, submission over independence, and humility over intellectual confidence. These educational patterns produced populations perfectly adapted for imperial subjects who would accept direction without question and perform assigned roles without resistance. The philosophical frameworks that supported Christian theology drew selectively from existing intellectual traditions in ways that served rather than challenged imperial power structures. Where classical philosophy had encouraged independent reasoning and critical analysis of social arrangements, Christian philosophy emphasized faith-based acceptance of revealed truth and divinely ordained social hierarchies. The transformation of regional variations in Christian practice into standardized imperial religion reveals the same top-down control that characterized the entire operation. Instead of allowing diverse Christian communities to develop their own theological and liturgical traditions based on local needs and insights, Roman authorities imposed uniformity that eliminated local autonomy and created centralized control mechanisms. The integration of Christian worship with Roman civic ceremonies reveals strategic planning designed to redirect existing social energies toward imperial purposes. Instead of developing uniquely Christian forms of community gathering, the new religion absorbed and modified Roman public rituals while giving them new theological meanings that served political goals. The success of this alleged operation exceeded anything its creators could have anticipated. Not only did Christianity eliminate Jewish resistance to Roman rule, it eventually became the dominant cultural framework for European civilization itself. The psychological patterns that were supposedly designed as temporary political expedients became permanent features of Western thought and social organization. The implications of this theory stretch far beyond academic debates about ancient history into contemporary questions about power, belief, and social control. If Christianity was indeed engineered as a tool of imperial manipulation, then every institution built upon Christian foundations may be unconsciously perpetuating control mechanisms that were originally designed to serve authority rather than human flourishing. The techniques that were allegedly pioneered 2,000 years ago continue to operate in modern political, educational, and media systems. The same psychological principles that supposedly transformed rebellious Jewish populations into compliant Christian subjects are still being employed to shape contemporary attitudes toward authority, economic inequality, and social justice. Understanding this history becomes crucial for anyone seeking to distinguish between authentic spiritual seeking and manufactured consent. The patterns that allegedly created Christianity continue to operate in our world today, using updated languages and technologies, but serving the same fundamental purposes of maintaining existing power arrangements while convincing people that their submission serves higher purposes. Whether you believe this theory or reject it entirely, one thing remains undeniably clear. The questions it raises about power, belief, and historical truth are questions every thinking person must grapple with in our modern world. Because if the foundations of Western civilization can be questioned this deeply, if the origins of our most sacred beliefs can be examined this critically, then nothing should be beyond the reach of honest inquiry. The techniques allegedly used 2,000 years ago to transform rebellious populations into compliant believers haven't disappeared. They've evolved, refined themselves, adapted to new technologies and new audiences. The same psychological mechanisms that may have convinced ancient peoples to worship their own oppression continue to operate today, and our media, our institutions, our very understanding of reality itself. So ask yourself this final question. If you can be convinced to never question the origins of Christianity, what else might you be convinced to never question? The rabbit hole doesn't end here, it's just beginning.